Well, we continue to follow the progress of the government's bill on assisted dying as it makes its way through the legislative process toward a June 6th deadline. A House of Commons committee last night finished its study of the bill and has reported it back to the House with some amendments. And the Senate is continuing its study of the legislation as well. We will hear from senators in just a moment. But first, to the foyer of the House of Commons, where we are joined by 3 members of Parliament. Sean Casey is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Michael Cooper is the Conservative Justice Critic, and Murray Rankin is the NDP Justice Critic. Good to see you all, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us here for our weekly meeting on this important bill, which we continue to follow closely here at CPAC. Mr. Casey, let me start with you. The bill came out of committee last night, reported back to the House today with some amendments. Has anything been significantly changed about this bill that changes the substantial structure and content of it as it was introduced by the government?
I think the fair answer to that is no. Probably the biggest significant change was shortening the reflection period for people who are seeking medical assistance in dying from 14 days down to 10. There were some pretty substantial changes to the preamble. There was a clause put in to recognize conscience rights. But in terms of the arguably the most contentious parts of the bill, the reasonable foreseeability requirement and the advanced medical directives, those features of the bill haven't changed. So there were 14 amendments in all, and those would have been the most significant ones. I think, in fairness, most people would say there has not been a substantial change in the thrust of the bill.
Mr. Cooper, is that the way you view it as well? Has it changed substantially in your view? And do any of the changes satisfy your concerns going into the committee process?
Well, I think in some respects the bill was improved at committee stage, in as much as there was included now in the preamble and in the legislation itself a recognition of conscience rights for individuals, physicians, and other allied health professionals. So that is a step in the right direction.
When you say conscience rights, that's for our viewers who may not follow that closely, for people who may refuse to take an active role in providing medically assisted death.
Right. So the legislation now has a section that expressly states that no one is under any obligation to provide or assist in providing medical aid in dying. So that is a step in the right direction. I would have liked to have seen it extended to healthcare institutions. I'm disappointed that it doesn't go that far, but it is, as I say, a step in the right direction. I was, on the other hand, disappointed that the reflection period was reduced. It was a relatively short waiting period at 15 days, and there didn't seem to be much of an explanation as to why it was reduced to 10.
Okay. All right, let me follow up now with your colleague, Mr. Rankin. Mr. Rankin, what's your view on the bill that's now been reported back to the House? Has it satisfied any or most of your concerns or none of your concerns? Is it something you think you can support now?
I would agree with both my colleagues that the bill is better than it was, but the elephant in the room, Peter, is that it's unconstitutional in the judgment of most constitutional lawyers in the country. So I won't be able to support a bill that I believe doesn't do what the litigants achieved in the Carter case. After all, we're not here to negotiate essentially what is the right position on medical aid in dying. We're here to figure out how to do what the Supreme Court asked us to do as parliamentarians, and we're not doing that.
Okay, to be clear, the bill still does not include, as we've touched on, measures to allow advance requests for a medically assisted death for people suffering.
I moved that, and the government said no to that position.
This is for people suffering from a degenerative disease, so that doesn't happen. I guess, Mr. Casey, to Mr. Rankin's point, does this bill, as it's now constructed, adequately and accurately respond to the Supreme Court ruling in your view?
Yes, absolutely, and we're not alone in that view. We heard from Professor Diane Pache, Professor Hamish Stewart just testified before the Standing Committee in the Senate. He also shares the view the bill has received enthusiastic support from the Canadian Medical Association. Look, the Supreme Court of Canada said that Parliament is best placed to put in order a regime with safeguards around physician-assisted death, and when it does, that it will be shown substantial deference. We are confident that this bill will withstand a constitutional challenge.
If they're confident, why don't they send it to the court for a Supreme Court reference? I mean, the Department of Justice has been taking the position reflected in this bill unsuccessfully before the Carter case. And yes, there are people who, on all sides of the issue, you ask for constitutional opinions, you're going to get different views. But the key Canadian Bar Association, Quebec Bar Association, and the like all think the bill doesn't comply with the Carter case.
Mr. Cooper, what's your view on that?
Well, I believe that the legislation does satisfy the Carter decision. It follows the parameters, and I believe it therefore is Charter compliant. But it doesn't mean necessarily that it is a perfect piece of legislation. I have concerns about the fact that one of the amendments that I brought forward to require persons with underlying mental health challenges to be referred to a psychiatrist for a psychiatric evaluation did not succeed. So that is another concern that I have as I weigh whether to support or vote against the legislation.
What happens to the bill next now? It's been reported back to the House. I think we're expecting some late night sessions this coming week for third reading debate on this. Mr. Casey, perhaps you have, as the government representative, a better indication of what happens to the bill now. What should we expect?
There are discussions ongoing between the House leaders of the three parties to see if they can come to some agreement with respect to how many people will want to speak to it and how long debate will go in the House. You're right. I expect that they will agree that we're going to extend the hours to allow as many people as possible to speak to it. And I would expect that there will be a vote sometime next week to send it to the Senate. If that vote passes, it will go to the Senate, where they have already started a pre-study on the bill. Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, what's your view on this became an issue when debate was cut short at second reading over the objections of opposition members. The government said it needed to do that to move the process along. What are you expecting about third reading debate? How much time do you think will be needed for that, Mr. Cooper?
I hope as much time as possible, but having regard for the June 6th deadline. And yes, I was disappointed that the government did cut off debate at second reading. I think there was an opportunity to have at least one more full day of debate. That didn't happen, and I'm hopeful that this time around there will be an opportunity to allow every MP who wants to have a say to have that say on one of the most important pieces of legislation that will come out of this Parliament.
Mr. Rankin,
I agree with Mr. Cooper entirely.
Okay. Let me ask you this then. Coming up in a few moments here, we're going to hear from two senators as they continue their study. Mr. Casey touched on it. They're studying the bill as well. They're telling us that they will send their proposed amendments on this bill to the House early next week. They'd like the House to look at their amendments before the bill gets returned to the Senate. And this gets into a bit of the procedural weeds here, but it might be important stuff, Mr. Rankin. If the Senate sends amendments they're hoping the House will take up there, and the House doesn't do that, that has the potential, I suppose, to draw out the process in the Senate. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I think that's right. There is that potential of a bit of ping pong between the houses, depending on if there are some significant amendments that the Senate sends to the House, they have to vote on them, and then, of course, if there's a change, that would presumably go back to the Senate and therefore back to the House. So it does get complicated.
Mr. Casey, is the government prepared to entertain possible amendments, having brought the bill to the House that presumably the government is satisfied with? You're going to hear from senators who want it amended in the House before it comes back to the Senate, where I suppose if they don't get what they want there, they'll be in a position to push to amend the bill there.
It's frankly difficult to answer that question without seeing the amendments that might be coming from the Senate. There were multiple amendments presented at committee that were debated and discussed. I think it's fair to assume that if the amendments coming from the Senate resemble those, that there won't be an appetite for it. But until we see them, it's difficult to say. And
what happens if the Senate amends your bill at the Senate?
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
That presents a potential problem for the deadline and everything else, doesn't it, Mr. Cooper?
It certainly does, but I guess we'll just have to see what comes out of the Senate. But I guess it also raises the question whether it will be necessary for the government to seek some kind of further extension. But I'm just hopeful that that can be avoided.
All right. Well, now it becomes a legislative process of back and forth, but it's good of you to take some more time tonight to let our viewers know where we are in this process that Canadians are paying close attention to. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's turn